quickly want to teach you some halacha about the counting of the Omer. You might know this, you might not, I'm not sure. Okay, so if you've forgotten to count the Omer one day, during the counting period, you may no longer count with a blessing on subsequent days. So what happens is you can, if the next day you remember, like from the night, you can say it, and then that night you can do a blessing. But if a whole day passes, you can't do the blessing. And the reason for this is because the Rishonim disagree as to whether the mitzvah of counting the Omer is actually one long mitzvah that spans along 49 days, or every day of the counting of the Omer possesses its own mitzvah. There's a whole discussion. So if we were to say, for example, that every day of counting possesses its own separate mitzvah, then even if you were to forget a day of counting, you'd still be able to continue counting the following night. For every day of counting is its own mitzvah, and according to those opinions, there's no correlation between the one day and the next in terms of saying a bracha. You can say a bracha. But if you didn't don tefillin for one day, you'd still be obligated to do it the next day, for there's no connection between one day and another. I'm just giving you an example. So it basically depends on who you hold by, but at the end of the day, we respect the more stringent opinion. So it says that we don't want to actually utter Hashem's name in vain. And that's why we adhere to the more stringent opinion, where you don't recite the bracha. I hope that helped you out, guys. You probably knew it. That's why.
Okay, go.
Are you ready for us so we can start the Gemara?
Yeah, I just want to ask you a question on the same topic.
Yeah.
Is that a rabbinical law, or is that from the Torah itself that says if you miss a day you can't?
That's rabbinic, because it's an argument between the Rishonim. So the Rishonim are like what do you call it? The sort of Middle Ages, etc., where they don't want you to say a bracha in vain. The bottom line of the argument is it one long mitzvah for all the days, or are they separate days as a separate mitzvah? Because if they're separate days, each day requires a bracha. But if it's part of a unison, then you can't waste a bracha if you no longer have that connectivity.
Well,
okay.
What happens if you say the wrong day? Let's say yesterday was 8 and you said 9.
I have no idea.
Is it okay because you didn't forget to say it, but you just said the wrong day?
It's a fantastic question, and as usual, Gavin will ask Rabbi Albach and get back to us. All right. Great question. Let's go into the Gemara quickly. So I just want to tell you where we ended off yesterday. We finished the Mishnah, and now we're discussing about what happens with a tam ox that attacks a person. According to the rabbis, it's half payment damages for either the excess or the counted amount of the full damage, but it's still half payment on the gufa of the animal, depending on whether you're holding like Tosfot or the Rambam or Rosh explaining Rashi. But it's still, whether it's the excess half payment damage or from the full damage aspect, it's still half payment from the gufa of the animal. But Rabbi Akiva says whenever an animal attacks a person, there's no such law as tam, whereas the rabbis say there is such a law as tam. Okay, so we just wanted to know in review how they got their particular answers. So the rabbis taught in the Brisa that the verse stated, in accordance with this law shall be done to it, which is expounded to mean like the law for an ox that does damage to an ox, so too is the law for an ox that does damage to a person. So in other words, just as in the case of an ox that does damage to an ox, the law is that tam pays half damages and muad pays full damage, and that law extends to damage to a person. So that's exact, but Rabbi Akiva doesn't learn it like that. He said he uses the word in accordance with this law. So what law is he referring to? When he said it specifically mentions this law, it's actually in accordance with the second one and not in accordance with the first one. What's the second law of the verse? Because this is in Shemot chapter 21, verse 31. It discusses the difference between, in the latter chapter, from verse 30 and 31 compared to 29. 29 basically and 28 talks about a tam. But the minute it hits past that towards 29, it talks about her habitual gora. So Rabbi Akiva is saying that it applies to the second part of the law. So as soon as you're dealing with a human being, we have to refer to the law of muad, irrespective of the ox's status. Okay? So therefore, when the Torah says shall be done to it, it indicates that he pays from the body, but he does not pay from choice property. So we kind of want to know what's going on here in the Gemara, because it seems as though it's still mentioning the word it. So it would refer to the body of the animal. That's exactly what even the rabbis say. And that's where they get the rule of tam. But Rabbi Akiva says, listen, as far as the rabbis are concerned, I agree that it refers to a dayu, or constraint on the kol v'chomer. So what's the kol v'chomer? Just like if a muad ox tax another ox, you pay full payment. So too, when an ox attacks a person, it's the muad status of the second verse. But a dayu comes to constrain it and say to the limitation of the body of the attacking animal. So when it refers to the verse to it, meaning the body, Rabbi Akiva says he holds by that. So it does have one limitation of tam. So then the Gemara say, in response to that, and according to the rabbis, why do they need the Torah to have written the word this law? Because Rabbi Akiva uses the word this law to referring specifically to muad. Does that make sense? So it says you go in accordance with the bottom one, meaning the bottom part of the verse of 29 to 32, 31st, that talks about the muad, and not the tam for verse 28. So they want to know, what are the rabbis, if that's Rabbi Akiva's opinion, what have they done with the words this law? Because in the verse, it basically says almost a repetition.
Yeah, you want to go as well?
Arthur.
Sorry.
But an atonement payment shall be assessed against him, and he shall pay as a redemption for his life that shall be assessed against him. So they basically want to know, as far as the rabbis are concerned, what do they do with Rabbi Akiva's word, this law? So according to the rabbis, that word was actually needed to free it from liability for the four things. Okay, so what do we mean? We mean that this law teaches that an animal that injures a person is subject only to the law stated in the passage. So what is that alluding to? The passage of an ox injuring an ox, which means the damages alone are paid. Okay, this is according to the Mahashal and from Rashi, which uses the word shalem, nezek shalem, full payment, but it's not subject to the law mandating payment for the additional four things. Pain, medical expenses, loss of employment, and humiliation. So what we learn from there, that the rabbis use the term this law to refer to an animal that damages a person, that even though it might be, according to Rabbi Akiva, a muad context, it's not like a person damaging a person, because a person has cognizance of ramification and understands what they're doing. So we learn, for example, that humiliation is paid when a person intends to hurt somebody else. So you say, well, why don't you intend that? Because keren damage is when the ox intends to injure and kill. And the reason being is that an ox is brainless. It's an instinct. It's not a choice. It's not a free choice as such. Therefore, is not obligated to receive those four extra payments. So the rabbis say they use Rabbi Akiva's words, this, to indicate not a limitation as far as tam to muad, but in terms of not paying for man damaging man. Right. Now the Gemara asks, so what does Rabbi Akiva respond to that? In other words, what source does he have to free it from the liability of the four things? So right now we've established that the rabbis agree you only have to pay for nezek shalom, actual damage. But what does Rabbi Akiva use as a verse to prove that you only pay for actual damage and not the four other things? So he says, Rabbi Akiva, he derives it from the verse, and if a man puts a blemish in his fellow, from what we derive, what is it? If a man puts a blemish in his fellow, but not if an ox puts a blemish in his master's fellow. Okay, I think that's pretty clear, guys. It's and where's that verse coming from? Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 24:19. What does it state? And if a man puts a blemish in his fellow, as he did, so shall be done to him. So it's only dealing with a human being there, and that is Rabbi Akiva's source. So I want to ask you guys, what do you think is going to be the response next in the Gemara?
James, I got a quick question. What do you mean by blemish? Is it like when it goes, or is it what do you mean by blemish? Like
a blemish is any sort of visible physical injury, and non-visible, like internal bleeding or whatever the case may be. So what it's saying is, this verse is that man is only subject to pay for additional things if man damages man, because it says a man damaging a fellow, but not if an ox damages a fellow. He's exempt. So Rabbi Akiva is using that as the source, and the rabbis are using the source of the word this law. In other words, this law is pointing to the law of you just pay for actual damage in the verse, in the Exodus verse. So then the next thing that the Gemara is going to ask very simply is, why don't the rabbis consider that source sufficient? What do you mean consider that source sufficient? I think Rabbi Akiva's argument is much clearer in a sense because he's using words for words. It's not interpretive. It's not saying this, this or that and attributing meaning to it. It's saying, look, go to look at Leviticus, and you can see that only those extra damages if a person damages his fellow, and that's his source, so it's clear. So the rabbis then say, well, that sounds clear to us, the Gemara says. Why don't the rabbis consider that verse sufficient? Why do they need to have the word this to allude to the Exodus chapter referring to pure actual damage and not using this verse in Leviticus? I think it's a good question. What do you think, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Gemara says, if on this basis, the source, if a man puts a blemish alone, I would have come to think that only payment for pain is excluded. But in regard to healing and loss of employment, I would say that he must pay the victim for these things. Therefore, the Torah informs us otherwise as written in accordance with this law. So what the Gemara is saying is the reason why the rabbis needed additional referring to this, meaning the chapter speaking about actual damage, is they said, listen, I can understand that when you look at a man putting a blemish in his fellow, that you have to pay for things that are quantifiable financial losses. What do we mean? Medical expenses is a quantifiable expense. Convalescing mean if you were well, you could have worked somewhere else, whatever your depreciated state now, and you have to recover and you're losing income. Those are tangible expenses. But what's not a tangible expense? So, pain. How do you put a value on pain? How do you put a value on humiliation? So it's said that unless the rabbis refer to the verse in Exodus saying, listen, this is the law, just like an ox that damages an ox, you pay for nothing but actual damage. You do so in a human being. Because you could think that maybe you don't pay the four other things that, like when a person damages a person, but you might at least have to pay for actual damages in addition to medical expenses and convalescing, because they're quantifiable financial calculations. Does that make sense? Kev, did I lose you at all?
No, I just had to get something off the floor. No, so medical expenses are tangible things, like or quantifiable, that you can calculate.
Yes, so the rabbis had to use that other verse referring to only actual damage of an ox damaging an ox to prove it's the same with a person, in case you would have said, well, listen, let's at least pay for some quantifiables apart from actual damage, but maybe not for pain or humiliation. Why not for humiliation? Because an animal isn't cognizant of hurting somebody, it's instinct. And pain because like that's man damaging man. So in order to just make it nezek shalom, the rabbis had to use the referring to the verse of when an ox damages another ox, referring to an ox damaging a person. Great, we've done that. Is everybody satisfied before we go to the next Mishnah?
I'm okay with it.
Okay. I mean, it's logical. If it's not tough. Okay, so that was the only Gemara on that issue. The rest was fairly clear cut. I'm going to share my screen. And Kevin, I hope your mom makes a refuah, and in order that she does, in your merit, say your mom's Hebrew name and then dedicate this Mishnah to her.
Yeah. Shifra Simcha Bat Yeta, speedy refuah shlema. So I read the Mishnah for her refuah. Okay, the Mishnah continues its discussion of goring by a tam. If an ox that is worth a money, 100 zuz, gored an ox that is worth 200 zuz, and the carcass is worthless, the damaged party takes the live ox.
Okay. I want you to read it again slowly so that you guys can absorb it properly.
Yeah. The Mishnah continues its discussion of goring by a tam. Okay. If an ox that is worth a money, that's 100 zuz, gored an ox that is worth 200 zuz, and the carcass is worthless, the damaged party takes the live ox.
Okay, so let me just unpack it for you. A tam. Okay, so the ox that is attacking is only worth 100 zuz. Okay, it attacks an ox worth 200 zuz, but this ox is tam, which means if your ox is worth 100 zuz and you gore an ox worth 200 zuz, what are you having to pay, Gavin?
100. That's
correct. Right. For what reasons? There's two reasons, Gavin.
Well, firstly, it's tam. So if it's tam, it only pays half to the value of the body.
Yeah.
To the value of the carcass of the animal of the tam animal. And in this particular case, the carcass is worthless. So that's why they suggesting going for the live ox.
Okay.
As opposed to, so normally what would happen is you would pay 100, but in this particular case, your animal is worth 100. It is half the amount, so you can just take the live ox without having any,
correct.
Any monetary. It kind of solves the problem.
Correct. That's what it's suggesting. But there are two reasons for it, Gav. The first reason is that, as you quite rightly said, if it took 200, if it damaged worth 200 zuz, you only pay half, which is 100 zuz. But even if the ox was worth 80 zuz, you would only pay 80 zuz because it's the limit of the attacking animal, if it was a puny attacking ox. So that's why I've had to mention that the attacking ox is only worth 100 zuz, so that this perfect case would work out. Does that make sense?
Okay, so Damon, in a nutshell, the first reason is, let's see if I've got the rest. The first reason is you only pay up the value of the goof, okay, which is 100. And the second reason is you only have to what's that word I want to use? If it's a tam animal, your leniency is only half of the 200 zuz dead ox, which is 100.
Correct. It's the other way around. Your first thing you do is half payment, and then you work out the body of the animal.
Okay.
But you said it perfectly, absolutely perfectly. So that's why I had to set out that thing, and that the carcass is worthless. Now that's a new phrase we're learning, Gavin. Let me tell you why. Kev, remember we talked about a pit, that if your ox fell into somebody's pit, they don't pay you the full damage. They just pay for the difference between what the carcass is worth dead and alive. So you still pay them compensation, but the difference. You don't have to, it's not your job for injuring that animal that you have to sell that carcass and give him the full payment. You just pay the excess of the damage. Gav, you remember this or not? In other words, you've got a living ox worth 150 zuz. It fell down a pit, and at the end of the day, it's now worth 80 zuz, right? So once the animal gets dragged up, you don't have to give the 450 zuz. You just know that his carcass is worth 80, and you pay the difference.
Okay.
That we learned in the case of the pit. So it appears this case is similar, which is what we're learning. We never learned this as far as ox damage and carrying. We just learned this with the pit. Okay. And how do we know? Because it mentions the word, and the carcass is worthless. So why mention that? What's the difference?
Is it the way the animal died that made it worthless?
I don't
One
know
was in a
why.
pit and one was killed by a horn. I mean, I was wondering, is that the reason? Wasn't
No. But what I'm saying is,
okay.
if it's not worthless, it appears that you probably inferred from that pay the difference. So if your ox, Arthur, attacked Kevin's ox, and while alive, his ox was worth 200 zuz, for example, okay?
Yeah.
And then say it was a muad ox. Let's just make the calculation simple. And then Kevin's carcass was worth, instead of 200 zuz, maybe 120 zuz. Then it would seem that you would only pay the difference, because Kevin can get something for his carcass, and the obligation is on him to recover his loss. You pay the difference. That
So now in this particular example, if the carcass was worth 20, so you got 100 for the thumb ox, 200 for the ox that got with the carcass is worth 0. If that ox was worth 20, then you wouldn't be able to take the loss, because the difference would be 80, which would be lower than the value of the ox. You'd have to then you'd have to sell the ox, I presume, if you don't have the capital to give the guy his
clever.
Right.
So that's exactly it. They've set up this case to be a perfect scenario to give about Rabbi Yishmael's opinion and Rabbi Akiva's opinion. That's why it had to be perfect. But what you can derive from there is the fact that it mentions that the carcass is worthless. It must infer that if it wasn't worthless, you'd pay the difference. I don't know, but that's what I'm inferring from this. This is my interpretation.
Okay.
I could be wrong. But
so this is Rabbi Kabb's interpretation.
Damon Kabb is not a rule that might be hooked up on benzodiazepines, but it would make sense because you don't have to mention that phrase. It's a superfluous, unnecessary phrase, unless we're learning later on that you pay the difference.
Okay.
Otherwise, why mention it? You don't have to say whether the carcass was worthless or not, unless it carries bearing, unless it has meaning. All right. Now that we understand,
because the Torah doesn't waste words, basically.
Doesn't waste words. So let's go through and see what Rabbi Yishmael's opinion is and Rabbi Akiva. Okay. So
let's go.
The Gemara identifies the author of our Mishnah. Whose opinion is our Mishnah? It is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. For it was taught in a brisa concerning our Mishnah's case, the live ox should be assessed in court, and its owner should pay the damaged party its value. These are the words of Rav Yishmael. So now it seems confusing, because at first it says, when you read this, Gav, I don't know, did any of you guys do prep on this stuff? Be honest, if you did.
What number are you on?
I'm on the 33rd daf.
33A or B?
I'm on 33, A4.
I had. So what's the question again?
Okay, so what I'm saying is, it's so interesting, because when a person does Chazorah, one thinks they understand it, and then when we go to the Gemara, we really learn there was so much more depth. So it starts off seeming confusing. It says, hang on, this Mishnah that we read is the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. For it was taught in a brisa concerning our Mishnah's case, the live ox should be assessed in court, and its owner should pay the damaged party its value. So when you read it at first, it seems confusing. It seems like it's adding Rabbi Akiva's opinion, and then said, no, this is what Rav Yishmael says in the brisa. So I want to eliminate any confusion for you. Okay? So what happens is, how do we know it's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva? Because Rabbi Akiva says that the ox itself is automatically transferred to the possession of the damaged party. And how do we know that's the case? Because it says at the end of this Mishnah, exactly as Kevin read, the damaged party takes the live ox. So Rabbi Akiva's opinion is that they're partners in the ox, and there's an automatic transfer to the possession of the damaged party. And how do we know that that's not Rabbi Yishmael's opinion? Well, very simple. Rabbi Yishmael said there has to be a court assessment. You can't just take the ox, even if it works out financially. It's true that you might have a lien on that ox, or that ox isn't free for the damager to sell. But until you get to court, you can't automatically take possession of that ox. Okay, so let's get it clear. Kev, What is the opinion of Rav Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva? Just put it as clearly as you can.
What we've just discussed now.
Yes.
I mean, I did go over it, but no, I don't remember everything.
You can pass. You can pass if you don't. I'm saying you can pass.
Let me just
don't want to answer it.
Pass. Okay. No, I just.
Okay. I know Arthur knows it. Gav, do you want to give it a shot?
Yeah. So what's the first guy's name again?
Rav Yishmael.
So Rabbi Yishmael, he goes by the following, that you take the carcass, the damaged ox, to get valued by the dead bin, basically, before anything else happens. Whereby Rabbi Akiva seems to be able, he seems to sidestep that. But with due respect, I'm just saying the way I see it. He seems to sidestep that move, and he just says, well, just take the ox, because specifically if the carcass is zero, the excess then is the full value of the ox, especially if it's off the amount of. So in this particular case, it works out nicely for Rabbi Akiva. But if that carcass has got value, then what does Rabbi Akiva do? So then it's a problem for him, because who assesses that value?
Okay, so that's an excellent question, and we're going to be attaching this in the next daf or two, and it is going to assess it. And that's why we might find that the opinion might or might not go with Rabbi Akiva. The more we know, the more we find out. But exactly, Gavin asked, I think, an absolutely brilliant question. If the math doesn't work out, how can you just take the ox? Because there's going to be drama.
But even if the math doesn't work out, the guy's still, because it's been so badly damaged and it's not salvageable, it's worthless. So he has to get some form of compensation.
No, he will. He will. We're not saying he's not getting compensation. The difference is how they're viewing it. So in perfect maths, Rabbi Akiva says, listen, just take the attacking ox because you owe me 100. The attacking ox did 200 zuz worth of damage. It's only worth 100 in terms of the fact that you pay half payment damages because it was Kabb, and it's limited by the body of the attacking ox, which is only worth 100 zuz anyway. Maths works out. We can take the ox in lieu of payment because the carcass that has been damaged is worth nothing. Rav Yishmael says exactly as Gavin said. Gavin said it over perfectly. Arthur, I know you do not. I just want to give Gavin a chance. And exactly as Gavin said, that it has to be assessed before the court in Beis Din, before any sort of physical action of acquisition or automatic transfer takes place. So that's good. And Gavin asked a good question. I'm coming to you right now and says, well, what happens if the math doesn't work out? Which is a perfectly reasonable question, Gavin. A great question, in fact.
So,
yeah.
So the concept of tam might not be applicable in this case.
No, it is, because the Mishnah starts off and says, the Mishnah continues its discussion of goring by a tam. It's the very first part of the Mishnah. So it's all we're talking about. And why is it so important it's a tam? Well, Kevin, I think that's a brilliant question. And you know why?
I know this. Wait, let me try on. I think I know the problem. So what happens?
The attacking ox is worth.
You can't take from the choice property. That's the difference. So I don't know if that's what you were going to say, but this is an important issue here. Is that this wouldn't work with Rabbi Akiva, I think, if the animal was more.
Excellent.
Because then you'd have to take from.
Excellent.
You can't hand out you can't swap the oxen.
Excellent. So what Gavin is saying, I think this is what he's saying, but if that is what he's saying, it's excellent, is that there is because you take from the damaging, you have to, because you're limited in payment by the attacking ox, it also means you're entitled to that exact ox in lieu of payment. You've got a lien on that movable property. Whereas when your ox is muad, you have to pay from choice property full payment, which means all that happens is the Beis Din says this is what the damage is worth, and you need to pay with cash or choice property, or you sell that attacking ox and you pay the difference in cash, but as long as the oak gets settled, from either choice property or cash, you can do with your attacking ox what you want, but there's no particular lien on that animal in a muad case. Excellent, Gavin.
Okay, and Dan, what I also learned in that area was also, according to his Mishnah, once you have the lien on that ox, you can actually use it for your own personal use during that time as well. Is that correct?
Not clear.
Or did I misread it?
No, this
Okay.
is the whole dispute. Can you, can't you, consecration, selling, usage, interest, can you attach assets once you've sold it to a buyer? We're going to go through all of these things, and I think it's a good point. I'm just going to read a few lines, and then we're done. Kevin's going to teach us, so Gavin can go to shul on time. So I want to give you a bottom line here. Our Mishnah follows Rabbi Akiva's opinion, obviously, because Rabbi Akiva said the damaged party takes the live ox. Okay, so the Gemara explains the dispute between Rav Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. In what issue do they disagree? Rav Yishmael holds that the damaged party is considered the damager's creditor and has a claim against him only for payment of money, not for the ox itself. But Rabbi Akiva holds that they are considered partners in the ox. And why are they considered partners in the ox? Because in Shmot chapter 21, verse 35, it basically uses a phrase which we'll go through, that it says they shall sell, meaning not one party shall sell, they shall sell the live ox, meaning that they're partners within it. We'll go through it more in depth. And Rav Yishmael disagree in the interpretation of the following verse, right? And that verse says, they shall sell the live ox and divide its money. So Rabbi Akiva says, the minute it uses the term, they shall sell the ox and divide its money, means there's a partnership. Rav Yishmael holds that the merciful one is instructing the court to sell the ox. And until the court does so, it remains the original owner's property. But Rabbi Akiva holds that the merciful one is instructing the damaged party and the damager to sell the ox. This teaches that they're considered partners in it, okay? So basically, the owner of the tam ox is only required to pay half damages from the body of the tam itself, exactly as Gavin said. How do we know this, Gavin? Miku 4, in the Mishnah in 16b, we learned this. Rav Yishmael holds that the damaged party does not take the live ox, rather based in assesses its value and requires the damager to pay the damaged party half damages up to that value, even though it's tam, it has to be assessed in court. So if the ox is worth a manna, so a manna is 100 zuz, right? Goes an ox worth 200, and the carcass is worthless, the damager must pay the full value of his live ox, meaning 100 zuz. It's not full payment, but it's full value in cash, which is equal to half the damage. But Rabbi Akiva holds that the value of the live ox, when it's equal to half damages, the damaged party can take the ox itself. So this also answers Gavin's question, which means when the math doesn't work out properly, we might hold by a different Mishnah. Does that make sense? It's fairly clear. All right, so guys, you know the two different opinions here. And I think on this note, we can end so that Gavin can go to shul. But I want Kevin, Rabbi Mayerthal, to teach us for a few minutes.
Okay, Rosh Hashiva and esteemed Kohanim and the Melech, and one of the Tanoim in absentia, Rabbi Akiva, we'll do this. Okay, so now starting a new chapter. Kiddush, Kiddush and the three meals. Okay, Kiddush. So there's a new chapter. Right. Okay, Shabbos is sanctified by Kiddush, which is recited over a cup of wine in the evening and again in the morning. 2 covered loaves are laid and on the table prior to Kiddush. Okay, so before I continue further, so they say that Leil Shabbat Kiddush, they call the Kiddush during the day as a bigger Kiddush, Kiddush Gadol. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. You see it in the
Didn't know that. I've learned something.
It means maybe it has more importance attached to it, but it seems, and the words are similar. You say Vacholo, and it's but it refers to it as, I don't know if it's, I don't think it's more important. They're both important, but by saying something is gadol, it would seem like it would be considered more, but I could, let's just see if it says it further. Okay, so a person who says Vayechulu on Shabbos Eve is regarded as a partner with Hashem in the creation.
Sure.
And this is from Shabbos 119b. By writing Kiddush, one is testifying to Hashem's creation of the universe and demonstrating acceptance of his authority. Okay, then it's anything to add on that? Because the next chapter thing is quite long. The next point. So you declaring that Hashem created the world and in 6 days and rested on the 7th. Created the heavens and the earth, and you declaring, you making the declaration by saying that of the importance of the day. What does it say here? It says, regard as a partner with Hashem in the creation. And you, as a testifying, yeah, so you recognizing the importance and the holiness of Shabbos, and that we need, it's a day of rest, because Hashem rested. And people didn't build the Mishkan, the 39 Melachot were not performed on Shabbos either. Anything to add to that, Gavin?
Kabb, I just want to answer your question quickly, that you should know in terms of what happens when the amount doesn't work out exactly. So whatever amount, according to Rabbi Akiva, that the damaged party has in the attacking ox, it still makes him a, Gav, are you listening?
I am listening.
This is for you. So what I'm saying is, according to Rabbi Akiva, the attacking, the owner of the attacking ox hasn't got a right to sell or consecrate the ox, because he's still partners, even if the guy's a 30% partner and not a 50% partner in the damage for a tam ox, whatever the percentage, he's got no right to then use the ox or sell or consecrate it, because they're partners in it. Okay, it's like having a joint business account. Whereas Rabbi Yishmael said there's only a lien on the ox, and if he doesn't, if he can use the live ox for something else, as long as he pays the value of it in a cash equivalent. He's got a lien in that the other person shouldn't do anything with it. So if he doesn't pay the cash, the damaged party can then confiscate the ox. But that has to be determined by the court. But if, for example, he does something with the ox, the other guy just has to pay the damager, the cash equivalent of what's owed. Whereas Rabbi Akiva said, nothing doing, because part of that ox is transferred to the damaged party, the damager can't use that ox for anything that would prejudice the damaged party.
Okay.
Because he sees value in that
Makes sense.
particular ox, not just the value of that ox. All right, and on this note, we end. Lovely to see you guys. Hope you have a wonderful evening.